In the new building. Thank the Lord for blessing us with this place. And I guess we used up all the parking spots out there first day. So praise the Lord for that. So some of you people sacrifice and park on the wet lawn next. A lot of rain this week too. Today, the update, the theme of a lot of what I saw this week was escalation. Things are escalating anywhere. Well, you see it politically, you see it in geopolitics. There are things escalating in Syria, in Iraq, Iran, Israel. Everything is escalating. Everything is accelerating and escalating. So we'll talk about this week, and I think it's another week where, you know, what we mention each week about the convergence of events, everything seems to come together, is coming together more and more quickly. So let me just touch on a few things. There was a website, a report, this happened 2 weeks ago today. There was a group, this is their Facebook page, it's called Stonewall Militant Front in Austin, Texas. They went out and they protested a church called Celebration Church, which on its website had stated that it was pro-traditional marriage and that sort of thing. They have this thing called incendiary news service, and you can see some of the pictures of the protest that took place there. Protesters chant, "Bigots out of Austin, don't come back." And this is from their Twitter account, Incendiary News. Protesters chant, "Bigots out of Austin, don't come back," as homophobic churchgoers leave. And here's a little bit of a picture of some of the things. Now, it's interesting. The guy is standing there holding a Pakistani Islamic State flag with the rainbow colors that the LGBTQ community pushes. And what they did was Celebration Church rents a public building from the Austin's Independent School District. And so the Stonewall Militant Front decided that they were going to protest them until the city or the school district in Austin decides that they will not rent to them any longer. Now, I think that you're going to see this happening on an increasing basis. So when I saw that, my first reaction was, praise the Lord, we have a building that we're not renting from a public agency or a state government agency any longer. And I think this is going to and there's a lot of churches, they rent movie theaters, they rent schools. I've spoken at a church out in Rock Harbor Church out in California a number of times. They rent from a local school district, and I think almost every school building in that district is rented by a church on Sunday. So you need to keep each of these churches in prayer, that there will be some fruit that comes out of these type of protests, and the people will act accordingly. But it's one of these things that I think you're going to see escalating. This conflict over same-sex marriage, LGBTQ issues, transgenderism. I don't see it rolling back. It's happening everywhere. One of the other areas where you're going to see increasing conflict, and you did see some conflict this week, is about abortion. This is a website, billboards that were put up by the AFIYAcenter.org, Trust Black Women. And here it says this: patients need medically accurate information, not politically motivated deception about abortion. And what they're doing is they're putting up these billboards around, I think this was down in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. They're putting up these billboards to protest pregnancy care centers where people would go and they would get actually accurate information about what an abortion is, what it does, and that sort of thing. But you see how they flip everything 180 degrees. And the people who are actually giving accurate information about what an abortion is and about the baby that's in the womb and that sort of thing, they're being called politically motivated deception about abortion. And this is what fascists do, and they want to shut down anybody. I mean, in fact, they had laws passed, I can't remember what states, but they've had laws passed in some states, I think it was in California, where you had to give certain information about an abortion, even if you were a pregnancy care center. You had to offer the abortion services. And the courts, I think, have struck that down as unconstitutional. But they don't, even though that happens, they go to Texas, and they're doing this part to rally the base because there's a big election there between Ted Cruz and some guy who identifies as a leftist and socialist. You saw the abortion issue kind of come to the fore this week in the confirmation hearings for Judge Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. I'm going to play a couple of clips. The first one is Senator Kamala Harris, who I understand is going to be running for president. She was, I believe, before this, she was a prosecutor, a district attorney, and the Attorney General of California. And so in that position, you would assume that she would know, for example, how to question a witness, how to maybe know what the Constitution says. And she failed on every case. I don't know if you saw the one clip. She was questioning Judge Kavanaugh, and he said, the question was, did you have a conversation with a lawyer at the Kasowitz-Benson firm in New York about Robert Mueller? And Judge Kavanaugh, I don't know if you saw this, he was like, can you tell me can you just answer the question yes or no, Judge Kavanaugh? Can you just answer the question? He goes, well, I don't think so. Just answer the question yes or no, and be careful of how you answer. And this is what a prosecutor, but she never had anything. Okay, she had heard a rumor, and she looked. People criticize me for using certain words, so I'm not. She looks like she didn't know what she was talking about. And it was just a political stunt. And of course, you saw the I'm Spartacus moment with Senator Booker from New Jersey. And I don't think I need to go into that because he looked like. But here was another series of questions that Senator Harris from California asked Judge Kavanaugh.
I'm going to ask you about unenumerated rights. So you gave a speech praising former Justice Rehnquist's dissent in Roe. There's been much discussion about that. And you wrote, quote, celebrating his success in stemming the general tide of freewheeling judicial creation of unenumerated rights. That is what you said in celebration of Justice Rehnquist. So unenumerated rights is a phrase that lawyers use, but I want to make clear what we're talking about. It means rights that are protected by the Constitution, even if they're not specifically mentioned in the Constitution. So they're not in that book that you carry. So what we're talking about is the right to vote. That's an unenumerated right. The right to have children.
He carries a copy of the Constitution. That book that you carry. She wants to be president.
The right to control the upbringing of your children. The right to refuse medical care, the right to love the partner of your choice, the right to marry, and the right to have an abortion. Now, putting those unenumerated rights in the context of the statement you made, which was to praise the stemming of the general tide of freewheeling creation of unenumerated rights, which means the interpretation there is you were praising the quest to end those unenumerated rights. My question to you is, which of the rights that I just mentioned do you want to put an end to or roll back?
3 points, I believe, Senator. First, the Constitution. It is in the book that I carry. The Constitution protects unenumerated rights. That's what the Supreme Court has said.
Boom! Listen, what she wanted was, because these are judge-created rights, and legislatures are allowed to enact laws. The objection that conservatives had is the judges could just go in there and they take it off the table. It's not a political issue like it should be. And so that was the whole problem with Roe versus Wade. It took a very contentious political issue off the table. And this was all about, I mean, you saw the person after person being drug out of the hearings, screaming and yelling, and be a hero, shut this guy down, vote against him, block his nomination. They then brought in a number of panelists, or people to speak on panels. I saw Ted Olson, and then this person who is a Free Methodist minister who works with a Free Methodist Church organization. Their headquarters is in Indianapolis. When Pam and I first got married, we actually rented a home. The Free Methodist headquarters was in Winona Lake, Indiana, where we lived when we first got married. And we actually rented the house, an apartment in a house that was owned by a bishop in one of the leaders of the Free Methodist Church. And so this person came in to complain about Judge Kavanaugh's decision on upholding the right of religious institutions and organizations to not provide abortion coverage. I want you to listen to this. Now, the reasoning here, I want you to listen to everything she said, and then we'll try to, we won't try to refute it. It's a slam. I spiked the football on Kamala Harris, so I could do a slam dunk. But I won't do that because somebody will take a screenshot of that and put it up on my Facebook page because it's happened. I know who you are. But just listen to a couple-minute clip of her testimony in front of the Senate panel about why Judge Kavanaugh should not be confirmed as a Supreme Court justice.
My name is Alicia Wilson Baker. I am a pro-life Christian and ordained minister from Indiana. If Judge Kavanaugh is confirmed to the Supreme Court, I fear that many women, especially those who can least afford it, will not get access to affordable birth control because of their employer's religious beliefs. Birth control allows...
Now, what you should know is she got married and she wanted to get an IUD. And because she worked for the Free Methodist Church and because of this decision, that was not something that was an IUD because because of how it operates, it actually causes an abortion. And so the Free Methodist Church decided that we did not want to cover those type of things. To make us pay as a religious institution, it goes against our faith. We shouldn't have to do that. And so she talked about how much it costs them and how they had to delay paying their student loans. By the way, she's a seminary graduate. Does anybody want to take a wild guess what seminary she went to? Just take a guess. No, it's in California. I heard somebody say it, Fuller Seminary, or as we refer to it, Fuller Cemetery. And listen to the way she tries to reason here. So now I'm going to get all messed up. Whoops.
Nothing in...
Let me move here. Okay. Here we go.
In my stomach when I remember the stress and anxiety that we went through just as we were starting our new life together. But what happens to those who cannot pay for their birth control? What happens to those who face an impossible choice between getting the health care they need and putting food on the table, or paying for childcare, or staying in school? If Judge Kavanaugh is confirmed to the Supreme Court, access to affordable birth control will be in jeopardy. If Judge Kavanaugh had his way, courts would give free rein to those who claim their religious beliefs override the law. As a Christian, I am against such broad interpretations of religious freedom. It is not right that employers may be allowed to use religion to avoid following the laws of the land. I fear that some will use this reasoning not to protect religion, but as a way to discriminate. As a person of deep faith, I would never impose my religious beliefs on anyone, and no one else should either. My religious beliefs are separate from the law, and that's how it should be. but Judge Kavanaugh's record shows he does not respect this critical separation. This committee and the Senate must weigh the harmful impact that Judge Kavanaugh would have on the health and well-being of so many people. I urge this committee to block his nomination to the Supreme Court. Nothing in our faith disapproves of birth control. We were making prudent and responsible decisions for our family, but our beliefs and our decisions were overridden by the religious beliefs of an insurance company. I still feel a pit in my stomach when I remember the stress and anxiety that we...
It was your employer who got the insurance. It wasn't the insurance. He got a policy, or they got a policy that didn't allow for this. Here she goes.
Went through just as we were starting our new life together. But what happens to those who cannot pay for their birth control? What happens to those who face an impossible choice between getting the health care they need and putting food on the table?
I think I already played that.
Or pay.
So she goes on, and this is her prepared remarks, and she says, I don't want to impose my religious beliefs on anyone. So what does that mean? Okay, what we know the rule that they're always projecting, right? Because the next thing they're going to do is to show how they want to impose their religious beliefs on everyone. So in her statement, and she says up at the top, I'm a Fuller Seminary graduate. Because of my faith, I am called to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God, citing Micah chapter 6, verse 8. My faith calls me to love God and love others without exception. You see what she's saying is you can only love God by allowing people to abort their children. And then she goes down, Jesus directs us to advocate for a just society that allows people to live their lives to the fullest. You know, you have to go to a seminary to get common sense driven out of your mind. You would not sit down and pick up the Bible and read it and come to that conclusion. And then she goes on to cite John 10:10. I've come that you might have life and have it to the full. In this passage, Jesus is not referring merely to personal salvation. He also intends for us to seek justice for the poor and the oppressed here on earth. One such way of accomplishing this is by supporting policies to assist mothers, single parents, and low-income families both before and after babies are born. And this means supporting access to affordable birth control. Really, why don't you just say what you think, young lady? You want it to be abortion. Because by permitting individuals to plan if, whether, and when to become pregnant, birth controls allows us to live our fullest lives. As if having listen, Pam and I were an infertile couple. It was very painful. We went through many years, Pam especially, went through many years of fertility treatment. We tried to adopt several times. And it wasn't covered by insurance. And we were a young family trying to buy a home just like this. But the way she acts is if you have a child, you can't live your life to the fullest. And as someone who couldn't, this disgusts me and angers me. I found a little Reason TV clip from a few years ago where Reason TV went to Occidental University. I believe you have a former president who went there, as I recall, to ask them questions about microaggressions and free speech. I just want to play a clip. This is from a few years ago, but I thought it was appropriate because it shows what's happening on our universities. And please hold your laughter until the end. It's not a comedy bit. It's not satire. This is real life. This is a real person asking very simple questions to college students at a prestigious university.
Have you heard of the term microaggression?
Yeah, that's a big thing on campus. If we see large-scale violence, we can name that as a macroaggression, but the way that we devalue that violence, the way that we silence that violence, that's a microaggression.
I'm asking an Asian American, where were you born?
Yes.
Very, very contextual, you know? That's not a microaggression, that's just asking where they were born.
Telling a black student that he or she is very articulate.
That is, yeah. Yes.
What about saying all lives matter?
I think because the history behind Black Lives Matter, it's kind of like appropriating a statement that was created specifically to talk about Black lives being lost to police brutality, so that is.
I'm colorblind. I don't see race.
Possibly?
I believe the most qualified person should get the job.
Qualifications aren't really the only thing you should consider when hiring someone.
But if you're saying that the most qualified person is someone who is not a minority or not of a religion you believe in, then yes, that'd be a microaggression.
Saying God bless you after somebody sneezes.
Oh, that would be a microaggression because of different religions.
Yeah, it could be a microaggression to someone who doesn't believe in God.
I think that the harm there is relatively minimal.
So there's still some harm, though.
I would say there's not harm, but if it's being asked, clearly someone found.
Maybe mini microaggression.
Perhaps.
Just on the concept of free speech, do you support free speech?
Yes, I do support free speech. And Oxy is an environment that also supports differing opinions.
Free speech allows you to have new input constantly, and I think that's like a really big part of the community here at Oxy.
Obama has actually encouraged this, saying that instead of college students being coddled, they should have these active discussions so that they can learn something new and change their viewpoints a little bit. Too much censorship would give a lot of power to few individuals, and I believe in a more even distribution of power.
I think that everyone should be able to say what they believe and what's on their mind. Those using the rhetoric of free speech are individuals who already are in positions of power, who are creating history, who are creating these dominant narratives. Free speech conceptually is about this idea of equality, that everyone can have the right to say something, but that's not the way our society works. That's not the way this college campuses work. We only hear the same reiteration of particular voices over and over again, and that's white students' voices. That's President Veach's voice. That's the other thing about free speech. When I say that it's about power and privilege, it only enables like things like hate speech, because it makes it seem that like everything that we say has equal weight, when that's not true.
Now, she led the protest against some conservative speakers coming there to speak and shut them down, or wanted to shut them down. And I'll bet she's on the dean's list. That's just my guess, because she has it down pat. But that's at a prestigious university, and I had to laugh when the guy goes, "Well, it's not really it's a mini microaggression. It's a microscopic microaggression," or whatever. It gets, and I watch these things. I'm sort of thinking, like, am I really watching The Onion or something? Is this a satire piece? But this was real. Let's look at geopolitics for the rest of the time. And this is a report in this morning's. I've mentioned this a couple of times in the New York Times this morning about Islamic detention camps that are springing up, especially in Western China. Estimates are that perhaps upwards of 1 million or more people are already being held in these detention camps, which even the New York Times, to its credit, describes as indoctrination camps. Now, this should be concerning to people as China tries to spread its influence across Africa, across Asia, the Middle East, even into Europe, by building its One Belt, One Road initiative. What they're doing in many places, for example, is particularly in poor African nations, they go in, they make massive loans for infrastructure projects, and in some countries, because they can't pay back the loan, China comes in and just takes over big aspects of the economy and manages it and gets the money. And they're doing this particularly in the area of natural resources, rare earth minerals that are necessary for certain technologies. They're trying to get control of that. But this just goes to show you how oppressive the Chinese regime is. And so now they're putting Muslims in detention camps because they have a problem with them. And in the report this morning that I read, this is on a scale that's not been seen since the days of Mao. And yet everybody wants to just talk about, all they want to talk about is the great Chinese economic miracle. In Europe, the unrestrained immigration is causing political earthquakes. In Germany, even one of Angela Merkel's cabinet members has started to back away from supporting Angela Merkel, who says she wants more immigration. And partly they need immigration because they need people to come in to pay the taxes to pay old people that are retiring. Because there's a, as I've mentioned many, many times, there's a demographic time bomb that's going on in many places of the world. Europe is not replacing themselves. Japan has been in sort of the economic doldrums for over 2 decades now because they don't have babies. So there's not enough people to pay the pensions of the old people that are retiring. And this is happening, it's actually causing a lot of problems in Russia right now because Putin has tried to raise the retirement age and everybody's getting very upset. But part of the problem is the Russian birth rate is somewhere in the range of, you need 2.1 just to stay even. They're somewhere in the 1.1 to 1.3 range, which means essentially that in just a little over a generation, there's half the number of people absent immigration. That has huge impacts economically on a society, what they can do militarily, because as it happens, you may not have noticed this, but most militaries in the world do not use old people. Can you imagine the 181st Air Infantry Division, and they're coming in their walkers? That would really strike fear into the enemy. And it happens to all of us as we get old. Things just don't. And so now here's the big problem. This is again from the New York Times and some other newspapers this week. Europe's last liberal bastion. Even Sweden is seeing the rise of what they call far right or conservative. They use those terms interchangeably. They don't have an interest in being accurate there. And so Sweden is even having a problem because people, they see what's going, the people that live in the towns and villages and cities, they see what's going on with immigration and that things are out of control and that things are changing and violence and crime and everything is going up, even though they cook the statistics. They do this in Sweden. They took certain things out of the crime statistics. And then they say, see, there's less crime. So that's something to pay attention to. Now, I will say this. A certain former president made a reappearance on the political scene this week. And as long as we get in here, a little bit after 11, I'm not going to play clips of him. So do your fellowshipping, but do it quickly. Talk fast. And develop some shorthand things like, just, hey, I'm doing okay, need some prayer, that type of thing. In Great Britain, the controversy over Jeremy Corbyn and his anti-Semitism continues to fester. The Labour Party this week did adopt the definition of anti-Semitism that everybody's wanted them to adopt, but they qualified it because they don't like Israel. And it would seem that anti-Semitism and anti-Israel kind of goes hand in glove to me. And so there's been some really good articles in the Jewish Chronicle, which is published in Great Britain, about the rabbis came out and they have attacked Corbyn. One did, the chief rabbi attacked Corbyn, the other rabbis came out in support. There was a good article last week in the Chronicle about how the German Jews failed to combat pre-Shoah hatred before the Holocaust, and that their concern is that these things are and I said, and put the statistics in, that these things are causing Jews to consider immigrating away from Great Britain. In fact, I think the number is now that if Corbyn was elected as prime minister, which is a possibility, given the way the Brexit thing is going and the way the pro-Brexit people aren't really necessarily in positions of power. Theresa May doesn't really support Brexit, so they're kind of fumbling the ball. They're not doing a very good job of negotiating the exit from the European Union for Great Britain. So So there's turmoil in their political system over there, and it's possible that Corbyn could be elected. And so now they say Corbyn is elected. About 40% of Jews said that they would immigrate from Great Britain immediately. Now this has some prophetic implications to it, because we know that God has said in scripture after scripture that he is going to regather the Jewish people back in the land of Israel in the end times. And part of that comes because they want to go there. Some of it goes because they feel that that may be the only place that they can go and be safe. Howard Jacobson gave a speech about Corbyn and his anti-Semitism. Let me just read you a little bit of that. This was given the other day. He is I believe he's a Labor Party member. So his address was on whether the Labor leader is unfit to be prime minister. And I think this is great. I love it when people are bold and speak their minds. And they do it in a very articulate fashion. Here he says this: "Something tells me you're expecting me to call Jeremy Corbyn an anti-Semite. There's been a bit about it in the press, and but I'm not going to call him anything. He says he isn't an anti-Semite. Hamas says he isn't an anti-Semite. The white supremacist David Duke says he isn't an anti-Semite, and that's good enough for me. Am I being ironical, ladies and gentlemen? I'm incapable of irony." Remember the clip I played where Corbyn says, "You people get upset with me hanging out with Hamas and everything. You don't understand British irony." We know what an anti-Semite looks like. He wears jackboots, a swastika armband, and shouts Judenross. Jeremy Corbyn wears a British Home Stores vest under his shirt and is softly spoken. Anti-Semites accuse Jews of killing Jesus. Corbyn is an atheist and seems not to mind if we did or didn't. Mr. Jacobson is Jewish. Whether that's because Jesus was Jewish and killing him meant one less Jew in the world is not for me to say, and he doesn't deny the Holocaust. Mind you, he knows a man who does. In fact, he knows a surprising number of men who do, that he denies ever having been in their company until photographs turn up of him rubbing noses with them at the gravesides of mass murderers, offering to show them his belief systems if they'll show him theirs. Gosh, they're the same size. Should come as no surprise. You can't spend your whole life in the company of blood libelers and Holocaust deniers and expect to remember them all by name. If I may quote from Oscar Wilde's missing play, The Self-Importance of Being Jeremy, to associate, he obviously understands irony and British humor, to associate with one's anti-Semite, you don't have to be anti-Semitic, Mr. Corbyn, may be regarded as a misfortune. To associate with anti-Semites on a regular basis looks like a predilection. Look, when I think of the scoundrels I've hung around with, I know how easy it is to get people wrong. And even when they turn up to meet you wearing hoods and holding burning crosses, and Jeremy, is it okay if I call him Jeremy, has never exactly been what you called observant. And he goes on to says this, he concludes, and what are we to make, speaking of Corbyn's unconscious, of his inability to disavow anti-Semitism out with reminding us of his lifelong opposition to all forms of racism, which is like answering the question, are you a wife beater, with an assurance that you always buy the big issue? Because anti-Semitism isn't quite racism. It is closer to superstition, embedded in theology, shrouded in medieval irrationality, updated to suit leftist economics, and exhumed whenever a single explanation for all the evils of the world is sought. To talk of anti-Semitism as a racism is a contradiction in terms for Jeremy Corbyn, since in his eyes, Jews are neither downtrodden nor exploited, but are, as usurers, bankers, colonialists, and conspirators, the very source and fount of racism themselves. Once hold Jews to be racist, and Zionism a racist endeavor, then no anti-Semite can ever be a racist himself. And any definition that says otherwise must be amended. You can look at that on the Jewish Chronicle website. Good speech. Which leads to this. report in The Guardian this morning. Muslim group calls for preacher linked to Trump to be denied a UK visa. And so the report is Franklin Graham is supposed to go to Blackpool and speak at a Christian festival, and now a Muslim group is saying, hey, we don't want him to come. He shouldn't be able to come to Great Britain. Let's look at the Middle East. The reports earlier this week, Prime Minister Netanyahu, Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman talked about the fact that there have been a lot of attacks by Israel in Syria against Iranian targets. Probably over 200 individual attacks at this point. 200 attacks on these different targets. And Prime Minister Netanyahu came out and said, listen, we're going to continue to do this. Lieberman said we're going to continue to do this because Iran has stated that they want to get rid of the Jewish state of Israel, and we are going to fight this. Now, what happened earlier this week was the reports came out that not only was Iran continuing to build up its influence and sites with Hezbollah and Lebanon, in Syria with the Syrian government of Assad, but also in Iraq, in the Shiite areas, that they were installing military installations, factories, that sort of thing, to make long-range missiles and essentially open up another front in their war. I don't know how else you would describe it, their war against Israel. One person came out and said, listen, if you start attacking Iranian sites in Iran, that's going to be considered a major escalation. By the way, back to Great Britain for just a moment. Earlier this week, in the midst of this debate about Corbyn, these posters started appearing at bus stations and bus stops around London. Actually, in the background of this photograph, you can see Big Ben. Israel is a racist endeavor. Now, they've been removed, is my understanding, but what you see is this continual attack of Israel. I'm not here to say that Israel is perfect, but I've been there a few times, and I can tell you that I probably met as many Arabs in Israel as I did Jewish people. They seem to function and get along just fine. But there's a problem. There's been a problem with terrorism, and they have to deal with it. Now, here is probably the big story of Bible prophecy this week, one of the two big stories. And this is the meeting that took place between Putin, Rouhani, and Erdogan in Tehran. It was to meet to deal with the problem in Syria. Syria has essentially taken back, the Syrian government has taken back most of its territory. There are probably a couple of enclaves, one in the southern part of Syria along the Iraq border. I guess there's three areas. The east of the Euphrates River around Dar al-Zor in the Kurdish areas, and then the province in the far north called Idlib. And Idlib has about 3.5 million people living there. The estimates are there are 30,000 rebels, terrorists, whatever you want to call them, that are embedded in Idlib. There's been a war of words going back and forth between Western powers like the United States, France, and others that Assad's going to use chemical weapons. We need to watch out. We need to prepare for this, and we'll respond if it happens. And then Russia and Syria, on the other hand, saying, hey, we know that there are these people going to do chemical weapons attacks, and we know they are. And if you know where they are, just go take them out. Nobody's going to get mad at you if you take out terrorists. And so it becomes very difficult. It's very contentious. I have friends who are like, oh my goodness, Israel wants to take over the whole Middle East. They want to take over Syria. They want to take over Iran. And frankly, I hear people on the radio saying this, and it doesn't make any sense to me. I don't see taking over Iran would be difficult for the United States. There's a logistics issue that's involved in these Bible prophecy fulfillments. For example, I know there's concern of people that the UN troops will come into the United States and take over the United States. It's possible that would happen, but listen, there are about 230,000 UN troops around the world. If they were all brought to the United States is pretty big. And I think they would meet a lot of resistance. So I'm not that concerned about it. I'm more concerned about companies and people in our government sort of violating our rights and privacy and that sort of thing and trying to control us that way. When the U.S. went into Iraq, I think the United States has 30 divisions of soldiers, maybe 33. It took 5 to 8 divisions, so 1/4, 1/6 to 1/4 of our military divisions to control part of Baghdad. Baghdad is smaller than Chicago. So I have a good friend, he was in the military, he worked out the logistics. We don't have, even if all of our troops came home, they may be able to control Chicago. Nobody's doing a very good job at controlling Chicago. Well, Barack Obama says that Rahm Emanuel is doing so. He said so this week. So we know this. So there was this meeting with Putin,
rebel-held
Rouhani, and
province
Erdogan.
is
Here's a
still up
Reuters
in the
report.
air. The Russian and Turkish presidents and their Iranian counterpart in Tehran Friday failed to agree on a ceasefire that would forestall a Syrian government offensive in the rebel-held Idlib province, a scenario which the United Nations fears could cause a humanitarian catastrophe involving tens of thousands of civilians. But the trio agreed in a final statement that there could be no military solution to the conflict, and it could only end through a negotiated political process. But as Syrian government and Russian warplanes mounted airstrikes in Idlib on Friday morning, Russia's Vladimir Putin and Iran's Hassan Rouhani, who back Syria's leader in the conflict, pushed back against a call for a truce. Turkey's Tayyip Erdogan earlier had called for a ceasefire in Idlib.
Regardless of the reason, any attack on Idlib will culminate in a disaster, massacre, and a major humanitarian tragedy. The entire 3.5 million civilians in the region will be affected by this.
Putin said a ceasefire would be pointless as it would not involve Islamist militant groups it deems terrorists. Rouhani said Syria must regain control over all its territory. Meanwhile, Idlib's residents are already preparing for the final major battle, digging shelters and preparing makeshift gas masks. Turkey's big concern is where they'll go once the fighting starts. Erdogan says his country can't afford to take any more refugees. The UN estimates any offensive would displace 800,000 people.
And so the concern is what happens to these people. Erdogan also met with Khamenei, as did Putin. They had separate audiences with him. Reports were all over this week. Idlib becoming the breaking point for parties in Syria, meaning the soft alliance that's formed between Turkey, Iran, and Russia. Now, we get very excited about this alliance because we know that part of Bible prophecy is that there will be this invasion by, it says in the scripture in Ezekiel 38, that there's a mighty army that descends on the mountains of Israel, the north part of Israel. We know that Hezbollah is there. We know that Syria is there. We know that Iran is there. We know that some UN forces have come back to the demilitarized zone in the Golan Heights between Syria and Israel. My personal view is that I don't think that Ezekiel 38 is imminent, but look, things can change very, very quickly. It could change tomorrow. Things could escalate. That's why I called this thing Escalation this morning. Things could escalate and change very, very rapidly. So there are many different views on when these events happen. Right now, the dispute is in the northern part of Syria near Idlib. And I thought I had a map in here. Syria. The fighting is in Idlib in the far north, a couple hundred miles or so north of Damascus. So it's kind of away from the borders of Israel right now. And it's a big problem. I personally, and somebody communicated with me this week, well, you just don't understand. Russia is a mighty army. I'm like, yeah, Russia's a mighty army, but it's a mighty army that comes into Israel. And right now, 3 countries that are supposedly in this alliance, they're having a dispute. Their meeting ended without any kind of agreement as to what they're going to do in Idlib. Because in Idlib right now, the rebels and the people that are there are mainly displaced Sunnis. There have been hundreds of thousands that have been moved from Sunni areas into Idlib. Turkey is a Sunni Muslim country. Syria is sort of Shiite. Iran is Shiite. And so they want to get rid of the Sunnis. This has been part of what's been going on in this war. The Sunni areas have been decimated in the Syrian civil war. And the result of that was a lot of people started moving into Europe. Millions of refugees. Turkey right now hosts 3.5 million refugees from the Syrian civil war. Before the Syrian civil war, the population of Syria was about 21 million. 2/3 of the people that were there no longer live in the same place, and there's somewhere around 6 or 7 million refugees and a like number displaced. So about 2/3 of Syria doesn't live where they lived 7 years ago. So my only point in this is that if it's a mighty army that is coming down into Israel from the north, I don't think it's a mighty army yet. It could be. It could build up very quickly. Russia has a lot of ships off the coast. They were having naval exercises. They're having the biggest war games with China since the end of the Cold War 20-some years ago. 30 years ago. So, yeah, it could change very quickly. I'm just saying there's not a mighty army there today, and I don't think there's what the scripture is talking about, a mighty army. And that's just my view. People disagree with that, and I'm fine. I'm just saying there's a logistics issue involved. And right now we have a lot of people from Hezbollah. Hezbollah probably has 50,000 or so troops. Israel has active duty 165,000. Now they have probably 2.5 times that number on available for immediate call up for reserve. But there's a disparity in the strength of military force. But look, Hezbollah with Iranian support is a problem. They have tens of thousands of rockets, many of which can reach into any area of Israel. And the concern is that they have a lot of launchers, they could fire a lot very quickly, and it would overwhelm any missile defense systems. So this thing can spin very quickly, I'll acknowledge that. But I also want to make one other point about this. There are many different views, believe me. Well, the one thing that was encouraging this week was I went to some prophecy discussion groups on Facebook, and everybody agreed with everybody else. No, they didn't. Everybody was arguing about the timing of this, the timing of that. And listen, I would just encourage everybody to be a little bit humble. I mean, I have my views. I hold them pretty strongly, and I'll defend them, and I'll argue them. And I'm a lawyer. I like to argue. People pay me to do it. I don't think I ever told a client this, but, well, I shouldn't say that because I was going to say sometimes I'd even do it for free, just for the sport of it. But I'm just joking on that one. But so there are different views. Some think that the Ezekiel 38 war happens before the beginning of the 70th week. The beginning of the 70th week happens when this covenant is confirmed. Some people, I think my friend Bill Salas is one, believes that the Ezekiel 38 war happens at least 3.5 years before the beginning of the 70th week. The reason for that is he knows that in the middle, when the Antichrist goes into the holy place and commits the abomination of desolation, that the admonition of Jesus is, when you see that happen, get out of town, leave Jerusalem, flee to the wilderness. So he says they burn the weapons that are left over from that war for 7 years. Well, if they're all fleeing out into the wilderness, there's nobody going to be around burning the weapons for those last 3.5 years. So that's why, and I think it's a logical, reasonable conclusion that he's come to, that maybe it's 3.5 years before the start of the 70th week. And again, that's not my personal view, but I don't think we need to get real nasty with everybody about it. I think you should always say, I believe that this will happen before the 70th week so far. Because listen, future events are not facts. Facts have not happened yet. So I would encourage everybody to be reasonable with your brothers and sisters in the Lord and argue, make your case, but remember your brothers and sisters in the Lord. Other people believe that the Ezekiel 38 war happens just before the beginning of the 70th week, and that some believe the rapture happens before the Ezekiel 38 war. Some think it happens immediately after. Others believe that the Ezekiel 38 war, because of some timing things, happens probably in the first 40 days or so of the 70th week, which would lead to the building of the temple, the starting of the sacrifices, and you can calculate the different days from the beginning of the sacrifices till the end, and I think make a good case. My friend Doug Krieger would be one that holds that. Other people put the Ezekiel 38 war later in the 70th week. Some make it part of the Armageddon campaign. I sort of bounce back and forth personally between part of the Armageddon campaign and in the first 40 days. So far. Always say so far. Because we don't know exactly when it's going to happen. And we're all watching and waiting. We're all waiting with great expectation. Now, I will say just one other caveat. And I heard a number of teachers this week and some of the things that I listen to, and I do listen to other people. I listen to people I don't agree with. They say that the Ezekiel 38 war will wipe out Islam. I heard somebody say that. I was listening to it this morning. PM heard it. We were playing it while we were getting ready. Now listen. Right now we have 50,000, maybe 100,000 Hezbollah troops. Don't know how many Iranians. The Syrians have been barely able to keep up, and they're not even really mentioned in the Ezekiel 38 thing, so we don't know exactly what happens to them. And we don't know how many people Russia has there yet. We know they have some contractors. I don't think they have a huge troop presence. But even if what's there right now was completely wiped out, there are 1.7 billion Muslims in the world, and I personally don't think that Islam is going to be wiped out in the Ezekiel 38-39 war. I don't. I do think that there are a lot of prophecies that are sort of cumulative in their effect, and a lot of them have their ultimate fulfillment near the end of that 70th week. All Israel shall be saved. I believe that by and large happens at the end of the 70th week. And I believe Jesus returns second coming on a Day of Atonement. And we can go, and I've taught about that. And someday, when the news quiets down, I'll probably go into that in more detail. And that's what I believe, so far. So far. And we don't know exactly how these things are going to spin. We don't know exactly how these things are going to happen. So watch, be ready, pay attention. I do think you should be paying attention to the news and what's going on in the Middle East, because these things could change very, very quickly. So that's about Idlib. There is a great article that Jonathan Spire wrote at Foreign Policy. Israel's secret war against Iran is widening. And what Israel has done is they have supported some rebel groups along the border of Israel because they didn't want Iran to get too close to Israel, because they're concerned about Iranian troops and Iranian affiliates being too close to the border of Israel because they don't want to be invaded. So they have tried to do like Iran does. Iran sets up proxies to do these things. And so Jonathan Spire goes through, and he does, I think, a great job of analyzing the situation. Just let me share just a brief, let's see. Israel's secret war against Iran is widening. This year, however, it became clear that the rebellion in Syria, thanks to Iranian and Russian intervention, was going to be defeated. Israel could no longer afford the luxury of relative inaction if it wished to prevent the consolidation of an independent infrastructure of military and political power by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps on Syrian soil, along the lines of its existing bases in Lebanon and Iraq. Israel's direct targeting of this nascent infrastructure began shortly thereafter. It's difficult to trace the precise contours of this campaign, given Israel's reticence about taking responsibility for attacks. It is also sometimes in the interest of both Tehran and the Assad regime to avoid publicizing Israel's strike. And last week there were some attacks at an air base outside of Damascus. And the initial reports were Israel did it, and then the official Iranian and Syrian government people came out and said, oh, no, that wasn't Israel. That was just an electrical short caused some explosions at an ammo dump. And you may have seen, you thought you saw missiles flying through the air, but that was just a hologram, I guess. Netanyahu recently indicated that the campaign, this going against Iran and Syria, was not over. The Israel Defense Forces will continue to act with full determination and strength against Iran's attempts to station forces and advanced weapon systems in Syria, Netanyahu told an audience in the southern Israeli town of Dimona on August 29th. He concludes, this is his last two paragraphs, it's perhaps more appropriate to view the Israeli campaign as one element of a broader multi-pronged effort to contain and roll back Iran's gains of recent years across the region. New U.S.-led sanctions and efforts by other regional states elsewhere comprise additional fronts of this campaign. And Trump has been taking it to Iran, threatening them with sanctions, and now a lot of European countries, even though Europe says we're not going to institute sanctions, these European countries, tanker companies and that type of thing, say we're not going to transport Iranian oil because we don't want to get caught up in the U.S. sanctions thing. The U.S. still has a lot of economic power. Spire concludes, given the depth and extent of the Iranian investment in Syria and the relatively sporadic, if kinetic, Israeli actions, it seems likely that a long, open-ended contest lies ahead. The Israeli campaign resembles nothing so much as the country's approach toward other troubled areas on its borders, such as Hezbollah-controlled southern Lebanon and Hamas-controlled Gaza. This is the very familiar method of cutting the grass, albeit carried out on a vastly larger lawn and using a broader and more intricate range of equipment for the purpose. Great article. Look it up on Foreign Policy. Israel's secret war against Iran is widening. Let's see, I have one more article here that I want to share with you. Let's see if I can find it. Well, the other thing that's going on, and I'll be done here shortly, is that right now, Iran has also been trying to sort of do in Iraq what it has done in Lebanon with Hezbollah. In fact, one article in the Arab News out of Saudi Arabia called it the Hezbollahization of Iraq by Iran. The problem is Iran got a little bit sloppy. The temperatures, it gets pretty hot in Iraq in the summer. 48 degrees Celsius or more. 48 degrees Celsius is, I believe, about 118 degrees. And I've been in 118 degrees, and believe me, it's hot. And when you're in the desert, it's hot and dry, and you can drink a lot of water. But what they did was they cut back on the power, which made them not have air conditioning, and particularly in the city of Basra. And there are riots. They burned an Iranian consulate yesterday. And so Iran's having a lot of trouble right now. Their currency is falling. They're having protests in Iran. They've had a huge drought in Iran. Now they've cut off some water and power in the Shiite areas. These are Shiites that are protesting Iran and wanting them to get out. Iraq had elections a couple months ago. They were not able to form a government. Al-Sadr, the Shiite cleric, you've probably seen his picture many times over the years since we went into Syria or into Iraq. His party won the majority, but they couldn't do anything about it because he was, they can't form a majority government. So there's a caretaker government there. So everybody, to describe it as a mess is an understatement. So there's Spire's article, and then there is Mordecai Kadar's article in Aretz Shiva, Israeli National News today. There's a war going on out there, and let me see if I can find this here because I wanted to read from it. If you could just be, because I think this is, and he has a different view than even I would. Here it is. By the way, if you're in charge of an Israeli news website, let me encourage you to just back off on the pop-ups just a little bit, okay? Goodness. So I want to read this, and I want you to put it in context. We know there's this war coming, Ezekiel 38 and 39. We know there are other wars. We never really talk about the Oracle of Damascus that's in Zechariah. We talk about Isaiah 17, about the destruction of Damascus, but we never talk about the fortress disappearing from Ephraim. Now, there are a lot of different views as to what that is. I personally believe that the Palestinian issue is tied up in all of these. And their headquarters is in Ramallah, which is on the border of Ephraim. Is that the fortress that disappears? Is there something done to take this out at this time? By the way, this week is the 25th anniversary of this. The Oslo Accords, September 1993, Washington, D.C. This is what happened on the White House lawn.
The children of Abraham, the descendants of Isaac and Ishmael, have embarked together on a bold journey. Together, today, with all our hearts and all our souls, we bid them shalom, salam, peace.
You know, of course, you remember this event that happened. Yitzhak Rabin, Yasser Arafat, and Clinton kind of shoved them together in this was a very famous handshake. And so what happened there was the Oslo Accords did lead to some things. They divided Israel into Area A. It's about 18% of Israel. That's under total Palestinian government and security control. That's where most of the Palestinian cities are. Jericho, they're along the Jordan River, Nablus up in the north, Hebron in the south, Beersheba. Then Area B would be sort of a joint control between Israel would provide security, but the Palestinian would have government control in the dark green areas. And then Area C would be, this is the blue area you'll see, those would be areas which would be under full Israeli control. And what they've done is they've created a system of roads that go through there. The Jewish settlements are, for the most part, in the blue areas. Some are in the dark green areas. And so they have these roads. They call them flyover roads. They don't really go through Palestinian areas. If you've ever driven on them like we have, it's interesting because nothing connects to anything else. There's ways to get around them, but you really need to be with somebody who knows. Our friend Joel Kramer, who was taking us around, I said, so if I ever wanted to come here, give me directions to get to Bethel or Ai. And he goes, well, I'll just drive you because I can't tell you what roads to take because I just know how to get there. And if they have, the Israeli IDF has roads blocked off, I know how to get around them, which didn't really help me that much. But so Mordecai Kedar, his article, he says this: war is raging in all parts of the Middle East, although there is a tendency to call the conflicts not to call the conflicts by that name because of fear conjured up by the word. One conflagration is the war Iran is waging against those headed by Israel, who stand in the way of its plans to take over the entire Middle East. And Iran does want to do that. They've said, we want to have a land corridor from Iran to the Mediterranean. And they've been working on it. 2 points should be emphasized. Israel's been battling the Iran-Syria-Hezbollah coalition from the air for several years, with almost no reaction from the other side. They don't strike back. There are various reasons for this low-level response, among them the internal Syrian war, Israel's technological superiority, fears of the coalition ending up in a war with Israel with its forces at a disadvantage, as well as Iran's shaky economic and government situation. Second point, my feeling is that the day the coalition decides to surprise Israel, now, so those of you who think Ezekiel 38 is close, this is Dr. Mordecai Kedar. He's a very well-respected scholar on this issue. So this is what he says. This is in Israeli National News this morning. Listen to this. My feeling is that the day the coalition decides to surprise Israel and take out revenge for its attacks is not far off. Is that Ezekiel 38, 39? Could be. People believe it's going to happen tomorrow. They'll say, see, I was right. And John Haller, you were saying you thought it was later so far, but now we know you're wrong. Okay, fine. I know it's coming. I'm not going to disagree with you. Israel must be prepared for an Iranian-Syrian-Hezbollah reaction at the time and place that coalition feels Israel least expects it. My wild guess is next week on Tuesday, September 11th, the second day of the Jewish New Year holiday. Why? Because that is Assad's birthday and his army officers will want to give him a special present. If that sounds hallucinatory, may I remind you that the Yom Kippur War did not start on Judaism's holiest day because the Arabs noticed its occurrence, but because it was Bashar Assad's daddy Assad's birthday, and his army officers decided that the Golan Heights made a nice birthday gift. He had lost the region in the June 67 Six-Day War when he was serving as Syria's defense minister and commander of the Air Force. This is a wild guess, as I said, but remember, the author of the biblical book of Proverbs in chapter 28 wrote, "Lucky is the man who is always afraid." So he goes on, he talks about the Battle of Idlib. He also mentions the Battle of Ramallah. The idea of a Palestinian state is on its deathbed, now that it has been mortally wounded by attacks from every direction. First to attack was Hamas, which divided the Palestinian Authority into two parts back in 2007, and has no intention of giving up its precious terror tunnels and weapons for the sake of someone suspected of security and intelligence cooperation with Israel. Now America has joined the realist camp that understands that any Palestinian state will soon become a Hamas state, this time in Judea and Samaria. And I will give the Trump administration, they have been very clever in the way that they've been pursuing this, taking away the refugee status, cutting off funds, that sort of thing. That can come about through elections like the ones held in 2008 and gave Hamas a majority in the Palestinian Legislative Council, or through a violent conflict on the lines of the 2007 takeover of Gaza by Hamas. The United States has also decided to stop giving artificial respiration to the two main pillars of the Palestinian idea. One, Palestinian Arab Islamic control of Jerusalem, cutting it off from Israel. That isn't going to happen with President Trump in charge. I shudder to think what would happen with a President Clinton, a President Kamala Harris, President Bernie Sanders, or President, I heard this suggested this week, dare I utter the words, President Michelle Obama. The other main pillar of the Palestinian idea, flooding the Jewish state with millions of so-called Arab refugees whose status is being preserved by UNRWA until that hoped-for day arrives. Now, Jordan, they come into this mix, they say, oh, we support a Palestinian state. But 72% of Jordan is Palestinian, and they need to do that to keep the Palestinians under control. So here's the conclusion, and I'll finish. In order to prevent a descent to violence, which Israel will be blamed for no matter what, Israel must take a few preemptive steps. The first and most crucial is to disarm the Palestinian Authority by means of drying up its sources of funds, transferring all authority to the heads of clans in each and every city. He's been a big proponent of this, having spent just a few days in Judea, Samaria, what they call the West Bank. You can see that they are very, very tribal. They hate Abbas in some areas because he's not from their tribe. He's not from their area. The second step is to take away all the arms in the hands of the Palestinian Authority security forces, weapons which will be turned against the other militias in the IDF, which will be accused of collaborating with the other militias. The third step is to find all the active members, or to be more accurate, terrorists belonging to Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the Democratic Front, the Popular Front, ISIS, and every other terrorist organization and alien ideology adopted by a few fanatics. This will purge the region from the jihadist and nationalist ideology, which has as its standard the destruction of Israel in every possible way. The fourth step, as I have said here in the past, is establishing emirates, sort of like the United Arab Emirates, in the Arab cities of Judea and Samaria. A Happy New Year to all. So, very interesting things, different views on when all these things are going to happen. We do know this, we know it's going to happen. That's a certainty. Exactly when, we'll have to see. Watch and pay attention. Father, thanks so much for your word. Lord, thank you so much for the blessings that you've bestowed on us to allow us to have our own building. We pray that you will encourage us to be good stewards of what you've provided for us, that we will use this place as a place to share the gospel with people, that people need to believe in Jesus Christ for the forgiveness of their sins, and they can be saved. Bless us this week. In Jesus' name, amen.